Okay. Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming out on this most beautiful evening. I'm Lisa Krasner, the Edward W. Kane Executive Director here at the Concord Museum. We have many virtual viewers with us tonight as well, so welcome to everyone. It's a pleasure to introduce tonight's forum, which is a conversation with Professor John Kaag and Professor Robert A. Gross to discuss Kaag's new book, Henry at Work, Thoreau on Making a Living, why we do it, what it does to us, and how to create more meaning in our work. John Kaag is the Donahue Professor of Ethics and Arts at UMass Lowell and external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. His books include Hiking with Nietzsche, On Becoming Who You Are, and Sick Souls, Healthy Minds, How William James Can Save Your Life, and the anthology Be Not Afraid of Life, in the words of William James, co-authored with Jonathan Van Bell. Robert A. Gross is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Professor of Early American History Emeritus at the University of Connecticut. His first book, The Minutemen and Their World, won the Bancroft Prize in American History. Picador Books has just released a revised and expanded edition ahead of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. His most recent book, The Transcendentalists and Their World, won the 2022 Gomes Memorial Book Prize from the Massachusetts Historical Society. Professor Gross is the former director of the Program for the History of the Book in American Culture at the American Antiquarian Society. He's a trustee of the Concord Museum as well, and a director of the Thoreau Society of America. He's also an honorary fellow at the Massachusetts Historical Society. So I want to thank the Thoreau Society for co-sponsoring tonight's forum. The Thoreau Society's annual gathering is coming up in July. I hope that many of you are able to attend what looks like a fantastic lineup of programming that they have scheduled. And now let me turn the program over to our speakers. Thanks so much.
Well, between the two of us, we've got the hometown crowd. So, Henry David Thoreau famously observed in Walden that there are nowadays professors of philosophy, but not philosophers. To be a philosopher is not merely to have subtle thoughts, nor even to found a school, but so to love wisdom as to live according to its dictates, a life of simplicity, independence, magnanimity, and trust. It's to solve some of the problems of life, not only theoretically, but practically. Well, by that definition, John Kaag is not only a professor of philosophy, but also a true philosopher. His latest book, co-authored with Jonathan Van Bell, wrestles with the major problem of modern existence, the place and meanings of work in our lives. Inspired by Thoreau's writings, it offers practical counsel, if not solutions, to the challenges of earning a living and pursuing a career in ways that realize our abilities and talents, fulfill our desires to make a contribution to the world, and enable us to live ethically and responsibly in the process. And yet the title of the book, Henry at Work, would surely astonish many of Thoreau's neighbors, who thought he was something of a slouch, idling away his days in the rivers and in the woods, and never buckling down to earn a living from a regular occupation or profession. In their view, Henry at Work is an oxymoron. So, John, how do you counter this view? How did you and your co-author come up with this title and subject?
Thank you so much. That's a lovely question. But first I want to thank the Concord Museum and the Concord Bookshop, but also especially you, Bob, for both being an inspiration to me over 25 years, and also supporting this book in the way that you have. So why is Henry David Thoreau regarded as a layabout and a lotus eater rather than a worker? If we think about Thoreau, oftentimes we think about him going on vacation for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days at Walden instead of actually buckling down to work. But what Thoreau, I think, is trying to do in Walden and also in his life is to encourage us to think about what it is to work and why we work, and to revise the ways that we figure out the business of living. And Thoreau is resigning from our modern economic mindset, or at least the economic mindset that he looked at in terms of late capitalism or industrial capitalism, and trying to figure out the ways that we can work such that when we get to the end of our life, we don't look back and discover that we haven't lived. That's what he's trying to do at Walden. He's trying to figure out how to live and work deliberately. And in 2020, as we were working through the pandemic, I was working through bypass surgery after a cardiac arrest, and my work life had come to an unceremonious halt. I had stopped writing, I had stopped teaching because I was on health leave, and I was struggling in a real way to figure out how to make my way through the next few years. And I called my friend, Jonathan Van Bell, and I said, I am not working at all. And he goes, he said, John, what do you want to do with your life, and why are you actually writing? Why are you, well, maybe we should think about the nature of work. And since I live 2 miles from Walden, I thought to myself, maybe I should think about Henry David Thoreau again, because it seemed to me at the time to give us some insight into what a post-pandemic world might look like and the way that we thought about our work. Gone were the days of brick and mortar offices. The Zoom culture had started, and we were really thinking about what it meant to have a work-life balance, which is what Thoreau was, I think, trying to get us to work through. And what struck me and struck us at the time is that Thoreau is working through financial difficulties and financial panic, especially through 1837, 1838, when basically the financial systems of the US stop lending money and people lose jobs and lose their lives. And when we think about the pandemic, this is also what was at least threatening us at the time. And so Thoreau's move to Walden was one of sort of personal desire to live deliberately, but it was also motivated by economic necessity in a particular way. And also he was trying to point out that the way that we both make money and make our living don't necessarily have to be the be-all and end-all of life. So that was sort of the motivation, at least in part, the motivation for the book. And Bob, you said to me during the spring when you were reviewing the book, you said, you need to make clear that Henry David Thoreau was not a resigner. In other words, he didn't just opt out of life, but rather he put a little bit of critical distance between himself and the system in which he lived, the system of capitalism, for example, or the Industrial Revolution, in order to get some sort of critical perspective on what it was to make our way through the modern age. But it really helped at that point to say, he's not a resigner. He's trying to resign in order to live more fully.
Well, it's interesting, the word resign and resignation have double meaning. One, and they're opposite. You can resign, that is quit, assert your will, and depart from something you no longer can tolerate. Or you resign yourself to circumstances, to authority, to the will of others, surrendering your personal agency to something that's imposed upon you. How does resign come to mean two opposite things?
I think about abandonment in much the same way. To live with abandonment means both to live vibrantly, but also to live in a state of abandonment. And I think what Thoreau is suggesting to us is a very old idea. And I think it comes out of, for him, ancient cynicism in part, where the cynic today, we think about cynicism and we think, oh, anybody who poo-poos the government, anybody who poo-poos institutionalized religion, that's a cynic. But for Thoreau, cynicism traced back to, Diogenes, who lived in a barrel, who criticized culture, but who also did so in order to realize that there are deeper commonalities between human beings that go beyond the sort of institutional frameworks that we oftentimes find ourselves in. Thoreau removed himself from society in order to point out that society was corrupt in particular ways, but also to connect himself with a wider humanity. And I think that that's in part what he was up to with his work. I think his interest in manual labor, his criticism of industrial capitalism, his criticism of the mills that popped up in Lowell and Manchester and Lawrence, were really, he was worried about alienation, about being detached from the sort of social structure that he found himself in.
So you discussed the episode in his life when, at age 20, he's hired to be the village grammar school master, and then put off by an intrusive school committee man. There are never such school committees, we know. Put off by an intrusive school committee man, and he just resigns. And yet, it was a depression. Why on earth would he do that?
Well, Thoreau believed that there were more important things than suffering the accidents of depression. You could basically sacrifice your moral life. And when the schoolmaster asked him to beat his students, he took an action that I've never quite understood, which is he then beat some of his students rather viciously for one day, but then he resigned. It was as if he couldn't continue to live with himself in the particular work environment where he found himself. And I think that the point that Thoreau is making in Walden is if we get down to the necessities of life, the actual necessities, they are far beneath what we actually think of as necessities. In other words, he says that the luxuries of life are not only hindrances, but severe obstacles to living a meaningful life. And so the relationship between gaining material wealth and the cost that we might have to incur in our moral lives is one that he was always concerned about. And I think that his interest in slavery or immoral work in the United States is a sign that he was concerned about that sort of tension.
Was his teaching job really apart from tutoring in the Emerson homes, was it really the only time he was an employee?
I think you probably know much better
No,
than
I
I
mean,
whether it's actually,
it just occurs to me, he
Yeah.
was an employee. He was an employee in the Emerson home
He was.
as a tutor, though I don't think he got, maybe Richard Smith will know, did he get paid? Did he go to Waldo at the end of the week or month and say, hey, excuse me, while you're thinking great thoughts, I need my pay? Or my sense is that, because when he surveyed for people, that's gig work, that's contract.
Oh, I see what you're
But
saying.
when he taught, he was an employee. When he was for the town school, when he held forth in his own academy, he was a co-proprietor with his brother John. So I ask this because it seems to me being an employee was for many people an utterly novel experience in industrializing America as the capitalist system expanded.
I think as you frame it that way, I think the answer is yes, that's probably the only point, but it didn't strike me immediately as that's what you meant. But yes, I think you're right. And if you think about Thoreau being contemporaries with Marx, he's basically concerned with very much the same concerns about the modernization of industrial capitalism and the way that oftentimes we lose touch with the physical realities of the world and the physical realities that we share with others. So I think that being an employee, as you say, always runs the risk of giving up something of your self-reliance, as Emerson would say, or the ability to listen to that iron string.
So what if we viewed Thoreau as one of the first major writers and thinkers about being an employee in a world where no longer is the economy going to be dominated by small individual proprietors, but rather by larger and ever larger scale organizations in which the individual has to fit himself?
I think that's a nice way of thinking about Thoreau. I would also add that Thoreau is concerned about the way that we become our own slave drivers, and the way that the wants and needs that we have for the large, as he described them, family farms surrounding Concord. These wants and needs that we have latch us to a particular time and place, but also latch us to a particular daily grind that oftentimes seem necessary. And Thoreau is simply saying to us, it is not necessary. Do you know what's necessary? Is that you will live and die. And that when you get to the end of life, we think about Walden. John Thoreau dies in Henry's arms just years before he goes off to Walden. And you know when a time is to think about living deliberately? It's when you're faced with that very crude reality of the fact that you are going to pass away all too soon. And that's a situation that Thoreau is intimately familiar with, and it creates the backdrop against which Walden is written. And there is no time to waste. When Thoreau writes, I want to improve my nick of time, which I think might be the end of your, the end of your book, when he says, I want to improve the nick of time, you want to do it before it becomes far too late. Like, that's the contradiction of learning and loving philosophy, is that you're very good at it at the end of your life, but at the beginning you're not so good. And then you get to the end and you want to learn, but well, too bad. Like, the time has passed. And that's a deep issue for Thoreau, who dies at 44. I'm going to be 44 next year. And just think about it. It can go like that. And I think that that's the issue of work, where oftentimes in Judeo-Christianity we think about work as a curse. Think about Genesis. When Adam and Eve mess up and are thrown out of the Garden of Eden, what does God give them? Labor, like work. And what Thoreau is trying to do, I think, in the course of Walden, is to reframe what it is to live a working life, and to think of it as a potential blessing if we can take up the work of our lives more meaningfully. And so I think about both Emerson and Thoreau as providing us a different type of theodicy, or a way of figuring out what it is to live only to suffer and die, so that we can live meaningfully. So
people may not know what theodicy means, so why don't you expand on that?
So theodicy it simply means that we as human beings are born and then we die, and in the course of being born and having to die, we suffer. And when we suffer, if there is a benevolent God, the question is, why does a benevolent God ever allow us to do this? Like, why is our fate the way it is? And for Calvinism, and then certain forms of Congregationalism, Trinitarianism, the stuff that basically form the backdrop against which Unitarianism and Transcendentalism arose, those answers were easy. God was in control, he had a particular type of plan, and we lived a life, it might hurt, but God had a plan. But during the 1820s and 1830s, that wasn't so compelling anymore. I mean, the first person to say God is dead was not Friedrich Nietzsche, it was Emerson. And there's a reason why Nietzsche read Emerson so passionately. It was because he was trying to figure out how to make our way in a life that seemed oftentimes shot through with tragedy and pain. And to do so in ways that institutions didn't necessarily accommodate anymore. In other words, when Thoreau looked around his time, when Emerson looked around his time, he didn't see individuals wedded to any particular institutional religion anymore. So how do you make sense of the fact that we suffer? How do you make good on life if we do? And that's sort of that's the way that I describe theodicy to both my family, my extended family, but also to my students, which is basically, how do you face the difficulties of life and think that there is meaning in life if there's no sort of institutional God or institutional religion?
So if Thoreau is looking for answers to that question, besides the religious traditions that were increasingly threadbare to him and others, what else could he have looked to? You talk about Hesiod, you talk about Virgil. Maybe you could describe something of the intellectual inheritance he had to bring to bear on these questions.
Sure, I'll try. So I mean, one of Thoreau's favorite works was the Georgics by Virgil, and basically this piece of writing is a story of a simple life, of an individual who works the farm and who understands working the farm as a sacred practice. It was the idea that he took up in the bean fields in Walden. You read it and you're like, why is he talking so much about bean fields? And why does he say that the beans listen to me and I listen to the beans, and why have this intimate connection with the world at large? So this is one sort of root from classical antiquity that Thoreau says that one way to understand the difficulties of being human is our separation from nature, and one way to solve the difficulties of being human is to get back to nature, and to understand that instead of running from nature, as we typically do because it's nasty, life in nature is nasty, brutish, and short, instead what we should do is immerse ourselves in it to understand, in Emerson's words, its commodity, its beauty, its laws, and to understand a particular order beneath the seeming difficulties of it. So that's one aspect of his inheritance. I think a really important other aspect of his inheritance is the non-Western traditions that Thoreau took up very seriously, particularly the Lotus Sutra and Buddhism, but also Hinduism. And if you think about what he bequeaths to Emerson, it's a bunch of books. And every single one of those books is from the non-Western canon, from the Upanishads to the Lotus Sutra to not a single book from Europe comes from Thoreau to Emerson after Thoreau is dead. Only non-Western texts. And I think that this sense of both the importance of the immediate present, in other words, let's think about the present in this rich way where we see that it's not simply, I think about fall in Concord and think about how beautiful it is, but how sad it is, right? These trees that are passing, that are so absolutely brilliant in their foliage, and then they rot, they pass away. In autumnal tints or tinges or leaves, Thoreau says that the trees teach us how to live and die. In other words, they teach us that the passing of things is just grace and graceful. And that's not something that many sort of Western modern ways of thinking embrace. So I think that sort of Buddhist way of thinking, but also the inheritance from Hinduism is really important for Thoreau as well. So that's sort of alternatives to the Western theodicy, I guess.
So in a sense, you've got one world, the world a lot of Eastern thought of cycles, of things constantly turning and turning and turning, versus the Western emphasis on growth and progress and straight lines, presumably going ever upward.
I think so. I think so.
So part of what you sort of provoke in me is to sort of sharpen the view that one of the key aspects of the social changes that people in Concord were, in New England were experiencing was that by the 1820s, many, perhaps most young men in particular, were not going to be farming in Concord like their families, were not going to be keeping stores like their fathers, or shops in the same way. They were going to have to make choices about where to live and what to do. And this is kind of a first generation in which it's a mass experience to say, I'm not going to necessarily be what my father expects me to be. So that challenge is sort of crucial for raising what's the nature of work.
I think so. Can you say, I'm going to throw it back to you because I'm curious. Can you say more about the time in terms of that jarring nature between fathers and sons, or between one generation and another?
So farmland is becoming scarce in Concord in the sense that what an 18th century patriarch could do, bestow farms on his children, gather them all around him, that's a rare occurrence by the early 19th century. And so people are going to either be moving to the frontiers, first in 1720s and 30s to southern Worcester County, then northern Worcester, Middlesex County, then up the cattle trail to New Hampshire, to down east to Maine, or then ever farther away. Even if they pursue the same way of life, agriculture, as their fathers did, they're going to have to do it in new settings, without familiar neighbors or kin around. And so, and if you're not going to inevitably pass a status and roles as well as an occupation on from generation to generation, then in a sense, everyone, this is unfortunately too heavily a male question rather than cross-gender, has to ask the question, what do I do? How do I live? Emerson, reflecting on this, said the question of the day, speaking of this period, was, how shall I live? And
yeah, I mean,
The early 19th century slave trade was a big part of what young men would go off and do to be able to create their fortunes.
like Bronson Alcott,
Right.
who didn't get a fortune.
Not all of them worked.
yeah,
But you look at Jamaica, Concord youths who went to Jamaica ended up with 30 to 60 times the wealth of their brothers who stayed here and farmed in that environment. So it was a time of enormous disruption.
I think a little bit about the fact that, like, Thoreau's views on travel and Thoreau's sort of local mentality in a particular way. And it strikes me that he was willing to make certain sacrifices in order not to exploit the West, for example, not to exploit the West and South, not to exploit Jamaica. And I think that that's something that came really to bear in the 1840s, but also in the 1850s when the question of slavery became really central.
Yes.
So I think that that's a really interesting point.
So you likened Thoreau to Karl Marx, and I had come prepared with a quote. And that is...
And it's going to show it that it's not like Karl Marx.
No. Around the same time, 1845, that Thoreau was settling down at Walden, Karl Marx was writing about capitalism and his own vision of a utopian society. And he writes it in the ideal communist society, nobody would be confined by the division of labor to a single monotonous field of activity, day in and day out, with no hope of relief. Instead, with society ensuring that the economy serves the general well-being, Marx writes, It will be possible for me to do one thing one day and another tomorrow. To hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, not criticize dinner, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. So was Thoreau a Marxist before his time?
I mean, think about that phrase, I want to work just as I have a mind. That's Thoreau, I think. I mean, if you look at Walden, there is a certain type of ebb and flow to his work that is completely anathema to our ways of understanding the 9 to 5. I mean, most of us, me included, wake up, we go to work, we come home, and that's it. And the fact that Thoreau allows the day, allows the weather, allows his inclination, allows his mind to dictate the work week and the work day in a particular way, I think is very instructive for us as we begin to think about our own professional lives in, I hope, a certain different way. Now, I also think about Thoreau's willingness to work odd jobs and to work gig work all the time. And I think the gig economy is something that is happening again right now. And it's something that I think Thoreau can give us as a way of thinking about what it might be to reconceive of labor for ourselves differently, which involves a change in perspective about where we live, what we consume, and how we think about growth and progress. Many of us, my wife and I included, think about having a house and owning a house as something that's really important to us. It's certain, but if you think about Thoreau, he lives, and I might get the number wrong, but I think 11 different houses, and he only owns one of them. He works with, or he basically lives with others his entire life. And if we think about that orientation, not necessarily as something to poo-poo, oh, Thoreau's a loafer or a sponge, or he's living off his extended family, but think about it as a different type of living that actually enables your personal and individual growth. That's something that I think Thoreau was acutely aware of in his life. Do you think, I always check with you whether I have my facts right.
I can just see my career now as fact checker.
No, stop.
Thoreau, not long after he and his brother John closed their academy, took odd jobs. And he reflects in his journal one day, after spending the day shoveling manure out of a barn, that the laborer's life is for me. The employer may have bound his hands, but his thoughts were free while he shoveled shit.
He did say that.
Yeah. So you wonder, was he whistling through the graveyard?
I don't think so. I really don't. I mean, so one of the moments where I thought, oh, I should work with a co-author is to work with this gentleman, Jonathan Van Bell. And he's from Oregon. And I did my PhD in Oregon. And they live a different type of life, or many people do, there. And Jonathan says to me, he says, I'm going to follow my father and pick a job where my mind can be free. His dad works as a driver for a local hospital, taking elderly patients to and from the hospital. But all the time, he gets to think. And similarly, Jonathan doesn't necessarily he works gig work, intellectual gig work, but still gig work, so that he can maintain some sort of freedom. And I think it's both a freedom of thought, but also a freedom to separate yourselves off from particular institutions where you might have a serious problem with the way that they're being conducted. I'll say it one more. So I think that civil disobedience only happens when you have an individual who isn't tied in so tightly to the institutions of power and control that are oftentimes incredibly lucrative. Jonathan told me that. He basically, Jonathan was my little daemon that basically said, Kaag, you need to wake up to the fact that the jobs that you hold tie you into particular ways of life. And getting out of those structures and getting out of those institutions might mean that you can, A, work different jobs, but also dissent from particular laws, conventions, or customs if you're free of them, if you're already free of them. And I think that that was a very powerful moment where I thought, oh, we should work together on this book because this is an idea that I had not passed through my brain in a long time. And that was an idea that he had and Thoreau had in spades.
So freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose?
Yeah, the thing is that when Thoreau thinks about the necessities of life in Walden, they aren't that they're very baseline. Shelter, clothing, vital heat, very baseline stuff. And what if we were to actually think about that in a really honest way? It would change our perspective on what political philosophers like to call the social contract, which is the relationship that we have between ourselves and the government. Thoreau stops paying taxes in part because I think he's thought about self-reliance in a particular way. Because he said, I don't need to pay taxes because the government's not providing me very much. And I think that that's something that's new to me in my thinking, but I was grateful to have it through the course of the book.
So one of the aspects of the book that's really charming is your use of personal examples. So I'm going to shift the focus now from our highfalutin intellectual history and ideas about work to your personal examples. So the division of labor was something that Thoreau criticized severely. What's it like to work with a co-author?
The right co-author can be magic. And we have a chapter on co-work, and co-workers can be a real pain in the rear end, like we all know it. But co-workers can also make light work if they're good ones. And if you find a particular, kindred spirit. So the example that I just gave about Jonathan bringing a perspective that I didn't already have, and he really changed. I couldn't have written this book by myself, nor could he. And I think that that's one of the blessings of co-authorship or co-work.
Well, you say in the book that you wrote it in 18 days.
I took that out, Bob, because you told me. You told me to, Bob. We wrote it very quickly because it was of a particular moment. And when you get into work where you feel very passionately about it, it goes like that. And so yes, we wrote it very quickly, but we also thought it better to take that comment out of the book.
That's because all the reviewers would be so jealous of someone who could produce a book in such rapid time.
But I think in part and Thoreau I think would say this, that when you find a proper form of work, it is the type of work that carries its own load. And you feel like you were sort of made for it. And you're not going to find it all the time, but when you do, it is a precious moment, I think. And in fact, I think Walden, Robert Frost said that it is the American classic. The writing of Walden, which took a lot longer than actually the time that he was there, is that type of work that probably carried itself. And I think that that's what we might strive for in life, or at least that's what I'm after. But I'm cognizant of time. I also want to make sure we have time for.
I've been
time
watching.
for
We were
you
supposed to
have been.
stop for, it's 7:40?
Yeah, I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Sure.
Okay. So, I'm going to put this personally to you.
Sure.
In your thinking about work, what was it like for you when you thought you couldn't work and you didn't know if you'd work again? Did that help you in writing the book talk about the meaning of work? And obviously, it's not just, I mean, you had a medical crisis, but we retire,
Sure.
we alter our careers, health problems bring us at any age suddenly into the sidelines that we never thought we'd be on. So what were you thinking about?
It's a very, very personal question. So I think that I had always grown up thinking that I had to work in order to be a person, in order to be loved. The harder I worked, the better it would turn out, the better my life would be. And if I couldn't work, God forbid. Like, if I couldn't work, then I wouldn't be worthwhile, I wouldn't be loved, and it would just be hell. And what's curious is that when you really can't work, you discover that that myth is simply not true. In other words, you're still a person. You still can walk, you can still be loved, or hopefully you can walk. Sometimes you can walk. You can still be loved. You can still make a life. And that then releases some of the obsession that you have with productivity, or at least it did in my case. And then you have this type of existential vacuum, which is to say, what do I do if I don't have to do these things in order to be loved or cared for or worthwhile? What should I do? Which I think honestly is a type of vacuum that Thoreau faced repeatedly through his life and dealt with in a very mature way, which is he thought about what it was to work in a different, more hands-on, more flexible way, and not tie your entire identity to a particular professional role that the modern age has instructed us to take on. And I think that for me was a moment where Thoreau really helped me through that time. He basically said to me, like, just thinking can be work. Just playing with the kids can be work. He was a nanny to Emerson's kids. Just going for a walk can be work. The right type of work, right? And I think that was very useful to me. So, but thank you for that question. It's really nice to be asked.
Well, in a way, what Thoreau did was dissolve the boundary between work and play, work and recreation. He wanted to be able, and I think he tries to show this in Walden, to realize his higher self in the very process of getting a living.
There's this remarkable place where he recounts being asked, a farmer comes by and says, "What are you doing, Thoreau, talking to the bullfrogs? Why are you interacting with them this way? Or why are you interacting with the woodland beasts? It seems like a waste of time." But then you see another moment where with the Alcott children, he draws the beasts or the animals to him, and you see that there has been some sort of value in what he's been doing all the while, even while his neighbors are poo-pooing his actions, which in moments where you lose the ability to have your standard professional life, Thoreau, I think, gives us some way of understanding work in a way that's quite life-giving.
That's great. Why don't we turn this over now to all the questions that doubtless you all have.
I'll ask that you ask that through the microphone so that everyone can hear. Let's start here.
Hi, thank you so much. So I always looked at Walden as Thoreau kind of questioning the whole middle class values thing. And during the pandemic, he kind of became like the poster boy of questioning what was real and what was important. You know, I discovered, much to my horror, that as a historian, I was no longer an essential personnel. And so that was really important. Are you essential? Are you not? Do you think that Thoreau and a lot of the other transcendentalists, Emerson included, weren't they kind of an early warning as to what was essential and what was not essential, who's important in society, what's important in society? Don't you think that's exactly what they were all talking about?
I think that that's definitely the case. And when you say a warning, they're pointing out that the essential nature of the professions that we regard as essential are rather misguided. And they'd probably also point out, at least Thoreau probably would, that the individuals who are essential are oftentimes the absolute silenced, invisible type of workers that support our society when no one notices. And I think Thoreau would have been much better on that than Emerson. Maybe not much better by the mid-1850s, but Thoreau was quicker to have that insight.
Hi, I think we're all sympathetic to leaving behind the workplace and everything that goes with it. Was there any conflict for Thoreau of missing the conveniences that work brings, such as being able to go and see Italy or travel to Germany and meet a philosopher or buy a new book?
I mean, he's certainly, there are few times where you see that the motivation for him was strictly monetary. What you do see is a desire for fame. In his college years, he wanted to become the poet. He wanted to be the best poet. He wanted to be published. So it's unclear whether he's doing that for monetary reasons or for simple fame, legacy reasons, which when Emerson talks about representative men and the great men of all time, I think Thoreau wanted to see himself there at certain moments of his life. That being said, I don't necessarily think that he was driven by those ends. What do you think about that, Bob?
I think it goes up and down. There are times in which Thoreau will, in effect, say, society, what need do I have of thee? Those are times when he's feeling rejected by society. And so, I mean, we're all prone to that, when we've done something that disappoints us and people tell us it's clearly their fault. So I think he's prone to that. Also, though, the key thing is his focus was on how does the individual realize himself or herself? How does the individual live ethically? And even in his responses to the Mexican War and to slavery, his concern is how does the individual prevent himself from becoming an instrument of injustice imposed by others. He devotes relatively little thought to how do people work together to create something larger. Could he have mused like Ruskin on the silent craftsmen who built the cathedrals and who are now unknown? The combination of people in cooperative activities had no appeal to him. He didn't want to go to Brook Farm. He'd rather keep board in hell than live in their heaven. Right. And so the absence of a social consciousness is just simply part and parcel of Thoreau's writing, even though in Civil Disobedience he'll say something like, I didn't come into this world with an obligation to oppose slavery, but I have to live my life without sitting on somebody else's shoulders. And sitting on someone's shoulders is, if you will, a negative form of engagement with others. He wants to pull away from that. The one thing I will say, though, that is crucial in his later development is he broadens what it means steadily to sit on the shoulders of others. And he almost turns that negative duty, don't oppress people, into a positive obligation.
I mean, one thing I might add is I oftentimes gloss this section in the first chapter of Walden on philanthropy. And he says that I'm not a supporter of philanthropy, but what I want is justice for all. And that, I think, is maybe not an early case because it does come in the 50s, but I think that it's instructive to broaden out what you said. I think he's moving in that direction.
Thanks, great talk. So when you were talking about the heritage of work, I was thinking of the present and how we have this fundamental structural change going on where, sons of fathers who worked in mines or on the factory floor are not able to follow in their footsteps. And, there are a lot of fundamental changes with globalization and so I'm wondering, and economists have been trying to wrap their head around this, about neoliberalism and globalization and, how's this all going to fall out? And they don't really know completely, but I'm just curious how a philosopher's perspective would look at this, fundamental change that's going on in our economy in terms of, not gig work, but trade work, and how trade work is fundamentally different today than it was even 20 years ago.
Yeah. I don't know how much I can bring Thoreau, thanks for the question. I don't know how much I can bring Thoreau to bear on that, but I will say this, that what was possible for individuals working on the factory floor and what sort of life that they could expect for themselves and what they could make for themselves, that type of life then pulled out from under the next generation of individuals, that type of dynamic is a dynamic that Thoreau was watching. In other words, when he was thinking about this time in the 1830s where young men and young women went west instead of staying on their farm, this is precisely the issue. They couldn't actually make good on the promises of previous generations. And Thoreau, I think, was very much aware of the way that this move westward by these families, the younger generations, was putting immense pressure on Native American communities, on indigenous populations, on African American populations. And I think that he would have been, today, I think he would have looked at the situation today and thought, well, this makes sense. Like, this is happening again. So the xenophobia, the racism, the exclusionary policies, yeah, this is false promises being ruptured. And it happened in Thoreau's day, and I would probably argue that it's happening today.
Maybe one more question.
One more question.
Thank you. And thank you for clarifying. I feel like you clarified a little bit the difference between, when you drew a parallel between Marx and Thoreau, the difference being that Marx's vision of what life could be that was fantasy in his time because it was not possible without collective action. He did not think that it was possible to live a life without a division of labor, and he himself, you could draw another parallel, he himself was sponsored by Engels and all that kind of thing. But I think that was clarifying. And I'm curious still about that though. Did Thoreau have any idea, other than as an individual, how he could live and work his best life? Did he have any concept at all of collective action, of how, because he was critical of society, he was critical of the middle class society, right? I mean, the ladies at church and the people with the big mortgages, but what did he advocate that they do to change that, other than individual actions? Did he advocate anything other than individual actions, is my first question. I guess the second is, when I think of Thoreau's work, I think of the new projects that are being done with his data on climate change. So the fact that he went out in his journals and his nature work, he observed all these things like bloom times going on. And to me, that a lot of his work was collecting data, and how he saw it, maybe, it would be interesting to know, did he see it that way in his own time? Because to me, that is work, and it is also work that we are now using to do our work, and we appreciate that work. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
I mean, so those are two nice, I appreciate those two questions. The first question about Marx, I think in Civil Disobedience, it becomes clear that Thoreau is talking about complicity and individual complicity and fighting back against having a moral obligation to break unjust laws. And while that doesn't necessarily create any particular type of community, I think individuals like Martin Luther King and Gandhi were very much ready to take those ideas and then put them into more collective practice. On the second point about data collection, I'll also defer to Bob on this, but I don't think that he actually thinks of his work as grandiose as sort of saving the planet. But what he is trying to do is to attend to nature in the most rigorous scientific manner that he can. But I don't think he had any sort of larger agenda for his data collection.
Well, I think he was interested, though, in figuring out the laws of nature as he could discern them. Remember, science in those days is very much an empirical study of things that are visible, not things that are invisible. And in that way, he thought he could chart the rhythms and you say the seasons, the ebb and flow of nature to discover something higher. But remember, as a transcendentalist, he thought that the discovery of the material laws would coincide with his experience of the spiritual laws of nature. So one and the same time, he could give you a, if you will, scientific hypothesis and a philosophical consummation. So I think that's it. And he did it and did not apply for a grant proposal. Did not seek funding from others. Did not say, okay, I've done it on my own, it's my civic service, but I'm putting it in for my merit evaluation this year. He did it for its own sake. And I hadn't thought about him in this way until about Marx, but so was Engels Marx's Emerson? Thoreau didn't envision himself, at least, as an agent of large collectivities. But if he was going to burn his draft card, he would have burned it on the same day the draft card burning was being marked, but he wouldn't have gone to the occasion. He had a coordination with society, but not.
I will say this before we go or say goodbye. I think that your comment makes me now think that he spent so much time in data collection in the last 12 years of his life. I mean, if you look at the pages upon pages upon pages of data collection, and your thought has given me pause because maybe he did think about precisely what we're dealing with. Because why would he spend that much time of his life doing something that seems to us to be just data collection? So I'll think about that more, so thank you for that.
Well, John and Bob, thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you all.